The moment I saw him, my son, tied to that chair, Christmas lights flickering above us like cruel stained glass, my heart shattered into impossible pieces. I dropped my coat, mouth dry, hands trembling like I'd been wrenched awake from a nightmare. But what he said next made me collapse right there on his apartment floor. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. Every morning for the past 10 years in my cramped Brooklyn apartment on Flatbush Avenue, I'd rise before dawn. The radiator would clank and hiss, fighting against December's bitter cold seeping through the thin walls. The constant hum of the city outside barely pierced the weight pressing on my chest. A weight I'd carried so long I'd forgotten what breathing freely felt like. I'd shuffle through my day in my worn slippers, the ones with the hole near the left toe that I kept meaning to throw away but never did, cleaning for strangers who barely acknowledged my presence, tending to the frail few who needed help but couldn't afford much, scrubbing floors until my arthritic hands screamed in protest. But always wondering why my own family treated me like a ghost haunting their lives, the stale smell of instant coffee from my tiny kitchenette, the distant honk of yellow cabs fighting through Brooklyn traffic, the graffiti outside my fire escape window that read, "Love yourself." Ironic, considering I'd forgotten how to do just that. My daily soundtrack drowned in a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning in shallow water. That Christmas morning, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was seeing Mrs. Chen from 4B dragging her oxygen tank down the hallway, alone again for the holidays. Maybe it was the silence from my phone, no calls, no texts, no acknowledgement that I even existed. I'd called my son David earlier that week, told him I might stop by unannounced on Christmas Day, hoping to surprise him, maybe remind him I was still breathing, still his mother. His voice had been cold through the receiver. "Mom, we have plans. Maybe call first next time." But I went anyway. Something pulled me to that faded postcard of an apartment building in Crown Heights, with its chipped paint and security door that never quite closed properly. The hallway smelled of fried onions and disappointment, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. When I climbed those 3 flights of stairs, my knees protesting every step, I never imagined what I'd find. The door was slightly ajar. Christmas music played softly from within. Silent Night, twisted into something sinister by the scene before me. There he was, my 45-year-old son, the baby I'd nursed through pneumonia and held through nightmares, tied to a wooden kitchen chair with what looked like extension cords. His head hung forward, dark hair covering his face. Empty beer bottles littered the coffee table. The apartment reeked of stale cigarettes and something else. Fear. My purse slipped from my shoulder, keys scattering across the linoleum floor like dice thrown by fate. "David?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. He lifted his head slowly, and when our eyes met, I saw something that tore through every hope I'd clung to for decades. Not relief, not gratitude that his mother had come to save him, but shame so deep it had curdled into resentment. "Mom." His voice was hoarse, defeated. "You weren't supposed to see this." I rushed toward him, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the cords around his wrists. "Who did this to you? Should I call the police? The hospital?" But as I worked to free him, he said something that made my knees buckle, made the room spin like a carnival ride gone wrong. "I did this to myself." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the grimy carpet, staring up at my son, trying to process what he'd just confessed. "I've been doing it for months, Mom. The gambling debts, the money I owe. I thought if I could make it look like someone hurt me, you'd feel sorry enough to give me more cash. I knew you'd come looking eventually. You always do." The betrayal wasn't the ropes. It wasn't the staged scene or the manipulation. It was the casual way he'd factored my love into his con game, the assumption that my maternal instincts were just another resource to exploit. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got to that moment. How 45 years of motherhood led me to my son's apartment floor on Christmas morning, realizing I'd been nothing more than a walking ATM in his eyes. It started long before David was born. Back when I was 27 and married to Richard in a small ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Chicago. Those were different times. Women were expected to sacrifice everything for family without question, without even acknowledging the sacrifice existed. When Richard's construction business failed in the early 80s, the recession hit Chicago hard. I was the one who suggested we pack up everything and move to New York. Fresh start, I'd said, bouncing baby David on my hip while 2-year-old Michael clung to my leg. New opportunities. What I didn't say was that I'd been accepted to a nursing program at Northwestern, that I'd dreamed of having a career that mattered, that the letter of acceptance was still folded in my jewelry box like a pressed flower from a life that never bloomed. Instead, I found work cleaning office buildings at night, while Richard looked for construction jobs during the day. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, the boys sharing a fold-out cot while Richard and I slept on a mattress on the floor. The walls were thin enough that we could hear every argument from the neighbors, every crying baby, every television show playing too loud. My hands grew rough from industrial cleaning supplies. My back ached from pushing heavy vacuum cleaners across endless carpets in Manhattan office buildings. But every morning, I'd come home to make breakfast for my family, to help with homework, to pretend that grinding exhaustion was just part of being a good mother. "Mom, we need money for school supplies," David would say when he was 12, 13, 14. Never please. Never thank you. Just an expectation that I'd somehow make it happen. "You always have something to spare," Michael sneered one bitter Thanksgiving when he was 15, his voice cracking with adolescent anger. We were eating generic turkey from the discount grocery store, but somehow I was still the one with hidden wealth in his mind. I remember staring at him across our cramped kitchen table, the one I'd bought secondhand and painted white with whatever money I'd scraped together. "Michael, I work 3 jobs to keep us afloat." He shrugged, already 6 feet tall and towering over me. "Then get a better job." The words sliced through me cleaner than any knife ever could. At 42, I was cleaning office buildings, taking care of an elderly woman named Mrs. Goldstein for $12 an hour, and doing laundry for busy Manhattan professionals who paid me cash under the table. Better job? With what education? With what time? With what energy left over from keeping everyone else's life running smoothly? But I swallowed the hurt, like I always did. Made excuses for his teenage anger, convinced myself he didn't mean it, that love meant absorbing these small cruelties without complaint. Richard found work eventually, but by then something had shifted in our marriage. He'd grown resentful of depending on me, of watching me leave for work each evening while he stayed home with the boys. Masculine pride is a funny thing. It can turn a man's wife's strength into his own personal failure. "You're emasculating me, Margaret," he said one night as I got ready for my cleaning shift. "Having my wife work while I'm unemployed." "We're partners," I'd whispered back. "We do what we have to do." But partnership requires mutual respect, and respect had been the first casualty of our financial struggles. The boys grew up watching their father resent their mother's sacrifices while simultaneously depending on them. They learned that love looked like taking without giving, that women existed to solve problems and absorb disappointment. When David turned 18, he announced he was moving to Brooklyn with some friends. "I need space," he said, as if my presence in his life was suffocating rather than sustaining. Michael chose college in California, as far from us as he could get. "I want to make something of myself," he explained, the implication clear, unlike his parents. By the time both boys left home, Richard had found a decent-paying job with the city, but we'd forgotten how to talk to each other about anything except the weather and bills. We'd spent so many years in survival mode that we'd never learned how to actually live together. The divorce papers came on a Tuesday in March 3 years ago. Richard left for Los Angeles, claiming he needed a fresh start at 68 years old. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd given him fresh starts my entire adult life, and now he was seeking one without me. "You can keep the apartment," he said, as if he were doing me a favor by leaving me with the lease on our tiny one-bedroom in Flatbush. "I know you're attached to it." Attached, as if my inability to afford anything better was some sort of sentimental choice. So there I was at 69, starting over again, but this time truly alone. The boys called occasionally. David maybe once a month, Michael every few months when he remembered I existed. The conversations were always brief, functional. "How's the weather? How's your health? Do you need anything?" What I needed was to feel like more than a burden to the people I'd spent my life loving. David's calls began following a pattern. First, casual conversation. "How are you doing, Mom? How's Brooklyn treating you?" Then, gradually, the real purpose would emerge. "I'm having some trouble with rent this month. My credit card got maxed out on car repairs. Could you help me out just this once?" Just this once became twice, then monthly, then whenever he ran short, which seemed to be more and more often. I'd sit in my tiny kitchen with its peeling linoleum and flickering fluorescent light, looking at my bank statement. My cleaning jobs barely covered my own rent and groceries, but somehow I always found a way to send David money, $60 here, $100 there. Once, when he claimed his roommate stole his rent money, $300 I'd been saving for a new winter coat. I wore my old coat for another year, the one with the broken zipper and the lining that had started to separate from the shell. But David's rent got paid. Michael's requests were less frequent, but more sophisticated. "Mom, I'm thinking of buying investment property, but I need help with the down payment. It's a sure thing. I'll pay you back with interest." The $5,000 I sent him came from cashing in my small retirement account early, paying penalties and taxes that left me with even less. The investment property never materialized. When I asked about it 6 months later, Michael got defensive. "The market changed, Mom. Real estate is complicated. You wouldn't understand." I understood plenty. I understood that my son thought his mother was too stupid to recognize a lie. But what choice did I have? These were my children. The babies I'd carried, the toddlers I'd protected, the teenagers I'd forgiven over and over again. Wasn't this what mothers did? Wasn't unconditional love supposed to be exactly that? Unconditional? The loneliness crept in slowly, like water seeping through a crack in the wall. At first, it was just the quiet evenings when the phone didn't ring. Then the holidays when invitations came late or arrived with so many conditions they felt more like obligations. "You can come for Christmas dinner, Mom," David's girlfriend Jennifer would say when she called. Never David himself, always Jennifer handling the emotional labor. But we're having Jennifer's family too, so it might be crowded. I'd show up with homemade cookies I'd spent 2 days baking, wearing my best dress, a navy blue one I'd bought 8 years ago for Michael's college graduation, and smile through conversations about people I didn't know, places I'd never been, experiences I couldn't afford. "Margaret cleans office buildings," Jennifer would explain to her relatives, her voice carrying just enough condescension to make me feel like I was wearing a scarlet letter, as if honest work was something to be ashamed of. I'd sit in the corner, watching my son laugh with Jennifer's father about investments and stock options, subjects that required the kind of money I'd never had. They'd discuss their portfolio diversification while I counted the bus fare home in my head. My grandson Tyler, now 8 years old, barely acknowledged my presence. He was always absorbed in some electronic device, responding to my questions with shrugs and one-word answers. "Tyler, tell Grandma about school," David would say without looking up from his own phone. "Fine," Tyler would mumble, fingers never pausing in their frantic tapping on his game screen. I brought him books, age-appropriate stories I'd chosen carefully from the Brooklyn Public Library's recommended list. They'd end up in a pile by the door, still wrapped, gathering dust like my attempts at connection. Last Christmas, the one before the Christmas when everything changed, I noticed Tyler showing Jennifer's parents pictures on his tablet, a school play I hadn't been told about, a soccer game I'd missed because no one thought to invite me. Grandma Margaret doesn't really do the sports stuff, I overheard Jennifer explaining to her mother. She's more traditional. Traditional, code for old, irrelevant, out of touch with the modern world. I'd spent 69 years adapting to change, learning new skills, surviving in a city that ate people alive. But somehow, I was traditional. Too traditional to matter. The breaking point came in February, 2 months before that devastating Christmas morning. I'd been feeling dizzy for weeks, occasionally short of breath. One Tuesday evening, while cleaning a law office in Midtown Manhattan, I collapsed in the bathroom. The security guard found me 20 minutes later, confused and shaking on the cold tile floor. The paramedics who responded were kind but efficient. Dehydration, they said, exhaustion, blood pressure through the roof. "You have anyone we can call?" the young EMT asked as they loaded me into the ambulance. I gave them David's number, then Michael's. The hospital kept me overnight for observation, running tests and monitoring my heart rhythm. Every time a nurse asked about family, I assured them someone was coming. David arrived the next morning, looking annoyed and rushed. "Mom, you scared me? The hospital said you collapsed?" For a moment, I felt that flutter of hope. The same feeling I'd had when he was 5 and would run to me with scraped knees, trusting me to make everything better. "I've been working too hard," I admitted. "The doctor says I need to slow down." "That's probably smart." He glanced at his watch. "Listen, I have to get to work, but I'm glad you're okay. Maybe take it easier for a while." He left without asking how I'd managed to take it easier when I depended on those cleaning jobs to pay rent, without offering to help or even asking what the doctor had specifically said. Just relief that I wasn't dying and therefore wouldn't become his responsibility. Michael called 2 days later. "Dad told me you were in the hospital. You should have called me sooner. I gave the hospital your number. They said they tried to reach you." A pause. "I've been busy with work. You know how it is." I did know how it was. I knew that busy was code for not important enough to interrupt my life for. The hospital bills started arriving in March. Even with Medicare, the tests and overnight stay cost more than I made in 2 months. I called David, explained the situation, asked if he could help. "Mom, you know money's tight right now. Jennifer's pregnant, and we're trying to save for the baby." Pregnant. I was going to be a grandmother again, and I was finding out through a request for financial help rather than a joyful announcement. "Congratulations," I managed. "When is the baby due?" "October. Look, about the hospital bills. Maybe you could set up a payment plan?" I set up a payment plan that would take me 3 years to complete, assuming I never got sick again. The pregnancy announcement that should have come with excitement and shared joy became another reason why my needs had to wait, why my financial struggles were less important than their future plans. Spring turned to summer to fall. Jennifer's pregnancy progressed, documented extensively on social media. Photos I saw only when Mrs. Rivera, my neighbor with the flower boxes, showed me pictures on her tablet. "Your grandson's going to have a little brother," she said, scrolling through Facebook posts I wasn't tagged in. I wasn't invited to the baby shower, wasn't asked about names I might suggest, wasn't included in the excitement of preparing for a new life that shared my DNA, but not, apparently, my relevance. The baby arrived in October, a beautiful boy they named Lucas. I learned about his birth the same way I'd learned about the pregnancy, through a casual mention during a phone call that was really about something else entirely. "Oh, by the way, Mom, Lucas was born last week. He's healthy. Everything went fine." Last week. My grandson was a week old and I was just hearing about it. Can I come meet him? I asked, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. Maybe in a few weeks. Jennifer's still recovering and we're not really having visitors yet. But Jennifer's parents were visiting. I could see the photos on Mrs. Rivera's tablet. Grandparents holding the baby, beaming with pride, included in the first precious days of my grandson's life while I waited for permission to meet him. When I finally met Lucas, he was 6 weeks old. I held him for exactly 10 minutes before Jennifer decided he needed to eat, then sleep, then have his diaper changed. Every moment was choreographed to minimize my time with him, as if my love might somehow contaminate his perfect new world. I brought gifts, a soft blue blanket I'd crocheted during those long weeks of waiting, tiny clothes I'd found on sale and saved for months. Jennifer thanked me politely, the way you thank a distant acquaintance, and set everything aside without really looking at it. Tyler, now a big brother, had grown even more distant. At 9 years old, he'd perfected the art of making me invisible. When I asked about school, he answered in monosyllables. When I offered to read him a story, he informed me he was too old for that baby stuff. Grandma Margaret likes old-fashioned things, Jennifer explained to a friend who'd stopped by while I was visiting. She's from a different generation. Different generation. As if my love was somehow outdated, incompatible with modern family life. November brought my 70th birthday. I woke up that morning in my tiny apartment, listening to the radiator clank and hiss, waiting for the phone to ring. David called around noon. Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry it's late. Crazy morning with the baby. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. No mention of celebration. No suggestion we get together. No acknowledgement that 70 years might be a milestone worth marking. Michael called that evening. Happy birthday. I meant to call earlier, but you know how time zones work. He lived in California, not China. The time zone excuse felt as thin as the affection in his voice. Rivera knocked on my door around 7 o'clock with a small cake she'd baked and a thoughtful card. We sat in my tiny living room, 2 women who understood each other's loneliness, sharing birthday cake and immigrant stories over tea. Family is not always blood, she said in her gentle way, patting my hand with fingers weathered by decades of her own sacrifices. Sometimes family is who shows up. That night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the city sounds outside my window, I began to wonder when I'd become the person nobody showed up for. When had my love become something to be managed rather than celebrated? When had my children learned to see me as a resource rather than a person? December arrived with the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. My arthritis flared, making even simple tasks like opening jars or buttoning my coat an exercise in pain management. But I kept working, kept cleaning offices and caring for Mrs. Goldstein, who at 91 was one of the few people in my life who treated me with consistent kindness. Margaret, you look tired, she'd say when I arrived for our twice-weekly sessions. Have you been taking care of yourself? The question should have been simple to answer, but I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something purely for my own well-being. Every decision, every dollar, every free hour was filtered through other people's needs and expectations. The Monday before Christmas, David called with another financial emergency. Mom, I hate to ask, but Jennifer's car broke down and we need repairs, with the new baby and Christmas coming up. He let the sentence hang, an unfinished plea wrapped in emotional manipulation. How much do you need? I asked, already calculating what I could spare from my grocery money. Maybe 400? I know it's a lot. But I'd pay you back after the holidays. $400 was 2 weeks of groceries for me, but it was also my son asking for help during what should have been a time of family closeness and celebration. I sent the money, transferred electronically from my checking account to his. A digital transaction that felt as cold as the December wind rattling my windows. Christmas Eve came and went without an invitation, without a phone call, without acknowledgement. I spent the evening watching old movies on my small television and trying not to think about Christmases when the boys were young, when our tiny apartment would be filled with laughter and torn wrapping paper and the chaos of family life. Those memories felt like someone else's life now, preserved in photograph albums that no one looked at anymore. Christmas morning dawned gray and bitter. I made coffee in my tiny kitchenette, ate a piece of toast, and stared out the window at the empty street below. Even the city seemed quieter, as if everyone else had somewhere to go, someone to be with. That's when something inside me shifted. Not anger, exactly, but a recognition that I deserved better than waiting for crumbs of attention from people who claimed to love me. I deserved to know my grandchildren, to be included in the major moments of their lives, to feel valued for more than my ability to solve financial problems. I put on my best dress, not the navy blue one, but a burgundy one I'd bought but never worn, and my warmest coat. I did my hair, put on lipstick, and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. "You are somebody's mother," I said to my reflection. "You matter." Then I walked to the subway station and took the train to Crown Heights. I'd been to David's apartment only twice before, both times by invitation for brief formal visits. The building was one of those pre-war walk-ups that had seen better decades, with a security door that never quite latched properly and mailboxes covered in various languages and multiple names. I climbed those 3 flights of stairs, my knees protesting each step, but my resolve growing stronger with every floor. By the time I reached David's door, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: righteous determination. The hallway smelled of fried onions and unsuccessful dreams. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. Someone's television was playing too loud in 3A. A baby cried in 3C. This was the symphony of urban loneliness, of people living parallel lives that never quite intersected. David's door was 3B. I raised my hand to knock, then noticed the door was slightly ajar. Christmas music drifted out. Silent Night played on what sounded like a phone speaker, tinny and distorted. I pushed the door open slowly, calling out, "David, it's Mom. Merry Christmas." The apartment was dim, lit only by the multicolored Christmas lights they'd strung around the windows and doorway. It smelled of stale cigarettes and something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. Empty beer bottles covered the coffee table. Pizza boxes were stacked on the kitchen counter. This didn't look like the home of people preparing for Christmas morning with their children. And then I saw him, my 45-year-old son, the baby I'd rocked through colic and walked through his first steps, tied to a wooden kitchen chair with what looked like computer cables and extension cords. His head hung forward, dark hair covering his face like a curtain drawn against shame. The sight hit me like a physical blow. My purse slipped from my shoulder, keys scattered across the scratched linoleum floor like dice thrown by a cruel fate. "David?" My voice came out as barely a whisper, throat constricted by shock and maternal panic. He lifted his head slowly. Our eyes met across that shabby living room, and what I saw there wasn't relief that his mother had come to rescue him. It wasn't gratitude or even surprise. It was shame so deep it had curdled into something uglier. Resentment that I'd witnessed his humiliation. "Mom!" His voice was hoarse, defeated. "You weren't supposed to see this." I rushed toward him, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the cords around his wrists. The knots were tight, but not professional. Whoever had done this had been in a hurry, or hadn't cared about causing pain. "Who did this to you?" The words tumbled out as I worked to free him. "Should I call the police? The hospital? Are you hurt?" My mind raced through possibilities. Drug dealers David owed money to. Loan sharks who'd grown tired of waiting. Some kind of home invasion gone wrong. In my worst nightmares, I'd never imagined finding my child like this. But as I loosened the first cord around his left wrist, David said something that made my knees buckle, made the room spin like I'd been struck by lightning. "I did this to myself." The words didn't compute at first. I kept working on the knots. Thinking I'd misheard, that shock was playing tricks with my perception. "What do you mean?" He looked away, toward the windows with their pathetic Christmas lights casting colored shadows on the wall. I tied myself up, Mom. I've been doing it for months when things get really bad. I sat back on my heels, staring at him. Bad how? The gambling, the debts, the money I owe to people who don't take no for an answer. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting a grocery list. I thought if I could make it look like someone hurt me, you'd feel sorry enough to give me more cash. The betrayal hit me in waves. First, the casual admission that he'd manipulated my maternal instincts for financial gain. Then, the realization that he'd calculated my love, factored my predictable responses into his schemes. "You staged this?" I whispered. "I knew you'd come looking eventually. You always do. And I knew when you saw me like this, you'd want to help." He finally met my eyes again. "You always want to help." I sank onto the grimy carpet, my carefully chosen Christmas outfit suddenly feeling like a costume I'd worn to the wrong play. The burgundy dress that had made me feel dignified now seemed foolish, optimistic in a way that hurt to acknowledge. "How long?" I asked. "How long what?" "How long have you been planning to use me like this?" He shrugged, the gesture made awkward by the remaining cords around his chest. "It's not using. It's family. Family helps each other. Family helps each other." As if the help had ever flowed in both directions. As if I'd ever called him during my hospital stay and asked him to tie himself to a chair to make me feel sorry for him. I looked around the apartment with new eyes. The empty bottles weren't from a Christmas party. They were evidence of liquid courage. The kind you need to tie yourself up and wait for your mother to find you. The pizza boxes weren't holiday mess. They were the sustenance of someone who'd been planning this performance for days. "Where are Jennifer and the boys?" I asked. "Her parents' house in New Jersey. They'll be back tomorrow." Of course. He'd timed this for when I'd be alone to discover him, when there'd be no witnesses to complicate the narrative he'd constructed. "So you sent your wife and children away, tied yourself to a chair, and waited for me to show up and rescue you with money I don't have." "You always find it," he said. And there was something like accusation in his voice, as if my previous sacrifices had been motivated by secret wealth rather than love. I stood up slowly, my arthritic knees protesting the movement from floor to standing. At 70, getting up from the ground was always a production. But that day, it felt symbolic, like rising from something that had kept me down for too long. "I'm not going to untie you," I said. His head snapped up. "What?" "You put yourself in that chair. You can get yourself out." "Mom, come on. This is ridiculous. Just help me out of these cords, and we can pretend this never happened." Pretend it never happened? Like the years of financial manipulation, like the missed birthdays and ignored hospital visits, like the way he'd trained me to expect nothing while giving everything. No. The word hung in the air between us. Small but definitive as a period at the end of a very long sentence. I picked up my purse from where it had fallen, gathered my scattered keys, and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" There was panic in his voice now, the first genuine emotion I'd heard from him all morning. "Home. You can't just leave me like this." I turned back to look at him one more time. My son, my baby, the person I'd sacrificed decades of my life to protect and provide for, sitting in a chair he'd tied himself to as part of an elaborate scheme to extract money from his 70-year-old mother. "You're right," I said. "I can't leave you like this. But I can leave you to the consequences of the choices you've made." The walk back to the subway felt different than the walk to his apartment. My steps were steadier, more purposeful. The cold December air didn't seem as bitter. Even the other Christmas morning travelers on the train looked less lonely, more like people who knew where they belonged in the world. Back in my tiny apartment, I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table with an old photo album I hadn't opened in years. Pictures of David as a baby, chubby and smiling in my arms. David as a toddler, taking his first steps toward me across our old kitchen floor. David as a little boy, proudly showing me a drawing he'd made at school. When had that trusting, loving child learned to see his mother as a mark rather than a person? When had my unconditional love become something to exploit rather than treasure? I closed the album and called Mrs. Rivera. "Margaret, how was Christmas morning with your son?" "Different than I expected," I said. "Would you like to come over for tea? I think I need to talk to someone." She arrived 20 minutes later with a plate of homemade cookies and the kind of presence that makes difficult conversations possible. I told her everything: the years of financial requests, the gradual exclusion from family events, the hospital stay when no one came, the Christmas morning scene I'd walked into just hours before. "Ay, mija," she said, shaking her head. "This is not love. This is something else. But he's my son." "Yes, and you are his mother, but being a mother doesn't mean being a victim." The word hit me like cold water. Victim. Was that what I'd become? Had I confused martyrdom with motherhood so completely that I couldn't tell the difference anymore? That night, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I turned off my phone. I didn't want to know if David had managed to free himself from his self-imposed bondage. I didn't want to hear his explanations or excuses. I didn't want to be manipulated into feeling guilty for refusing to participate in my own exploitation. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, Boxing Day, the phone was full of messages. David, increasingly frantic as his calls went straight to voicemail. Jennifer demanding to know what I'd done to upset David. Even Michael dragged into the drama from 3 time zones away. I listened to each message once, then deleted them all. Instead of returning calls, I did something unprecedented. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Mrs. Rivera had given me the name of someone who specialized in elder care and financial abuse, a woman named Sarah Chen who worked out of a small office in Park Slope. "Family can be the worst financial predators," Sarah explained during our consultation 2 days later. "They know all your emotional buttons, all your fears, all the ways to make exploitation look like love." She helped me review my financial records from the past 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable once we laid it out on paper. Increasingly frequent requests from David, always framed as emergencies, always coupled with promises to pay me back that were never fulfilled. "Conservatively, you've given your son over $12,000 in the past 5 years, Sarah calculated. "And that's just what you can document. How much of that was repaid?" 0. Not $1 had ever been returned, despite repeated promises and elaborate explanations about delayed paychecks and unexpected expenses. "Mrs. Thompson, what you've experienced is financial elder abuse. It's surprisingly common, and it's devastating precisely because it comes from people we love and trust." Financial elder abuse. The phrase gave a name to something I'd been experiencing but hadn't been able to identify. It legitimized my growing sense that something was profoundly wrong with the family dynamics I'd accepted for so long. Sarah helped me understand my rights, my options, the resources available to protect my remaining assets from further manipulation. She also recommended a therapist who specialized in family trauma and boundary setting. "Learning to say no to people you love is one of the hardest things anyone can do," she told me. "But sometimes it's the most loving thing possible." The therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, different Jennifer, I noted with grim humor, had an office that felt like a sanctuary. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, boxes of tissues strategically placed for the inevitable tears. "Tell me about your children," she said during our first session. I found myself describing not the men they'd become, but the boys they'd been. David, sensitive and artistic, who used to draw me pictures and leave them on my pillow. Michael, logical and determined, who used to explain his school projects to me with such passionate detail that I'd understand subjects I'd never formally studied. "When did that change?" Dr. Walsh asked. The question opened something I'd kept carefully sealed for years. The tears came in waves, decades of swallowed hurt and unacknowledged grief pouring out in her quiet office. "I think," I said through tears, "I taught them that my love had no limits, and they learned to test that theory until they broke it. Or until you broke." By the time January rolled around, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. I was going to stop sending money to David, stop enabling Michael's vague investment schemes, stop accepting crumbs of attention as if they were full meals of affection. The first test came on January 15th, when David called with another emergency. "Mom, I'm in real trouble this time. The people I owe money to aren't playing games anymore. I need $500 or they're going to." Well, let's just say it won't be good. 6 months earlier, I would have found the money somehow, borrowed against my next month's rent, or skipped meals to help him. Instead, I heard my own voice, calm and clear, saying something I'd never said before. "No, David." "I can't help you with that." Silence on the other end. Then, "What do you mean you can't? It's $500, not $5,000. "I mean I won't. I'm not going to give you money anymore." "Mom, you don't understand. These aren't nice people. This isn't a game." "You're right," I said. "It's not a game. It's your life and your choices and your consequences to manage." The conversation escalated quickly. David's voice grew desperate, then angry, then manipulative in ways that would have worked on me before Christmas morning. "Fine," he finally said, "but don't come crying to me when you're old and alone and need help. Don't expect me to take care of you when you wouldn't take care of me." The threat was meant to terrify me, to make me imagine a future where my lack of generosity would be repaid with abandonment. Instead, it clarified something important. I was already alone. The relationship I'd been funding wasn't providing me with love or security or companionship. It was just an expensive way to postpone dealing with reality. "I understand," I told him. "I hope you figure things out." I hung up and immediately called Dr. Walsh to schedule an emergency session. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from something I hadn't felt in decades: pride in my own backbone. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of liberation and loneliness. Without the constant drain of family financial crises, I had money left over at the end of each month for the first time in years. I bought fresh flowers for my apartment. I replaced my broken winter coat. I took Mrs. Rivera out to dinner at a nice restaurant in Brooklyn Heights, where we could watch the sunset over the Manhattan skyline. But I also had to face the reality that cutting off the money had effectively cut off most of the contact. David stopped calling entirely. Michael's calls became even less frequent. The absence of crisis-driven communication revealed how little genuine relationship we'd maintained. In February, I made another unprecedented decision. I enrolled in a photography class at the Brooklyn Community Center. I'd always loved taking pictures, but had never had time or money to pursue it seriously. At 70, I figured it was now or never. The class met twice a week in the evenings, a group of mostly older adults exploring creativity in ways our younger selves had never allowed. There was Robert, a retired postal worker who photographed urban wildlife. Maria, a former teacher who specialized in street art. James, a widower who documented architectural details with an artist's eye for light and shadow. For the first time in decades, I was in a room full of people who knew me for who I was rather than what I could provide. They called me Margaret, not Mom or Mrs. Thompson. They asked about my photographs, not my checkbook. I discovered I had a talent for capturing quiet moments: an elderly man feeding pigeons in Prospect Park, children playing in the spray of an opened fire hydrant, the way morning light fell across the produce stands at the farmer's market. My instructor, a young woman named Ashley, encouraged me to see my neighborhood through fresh eyes. "You have a gift for finding beauty in ordinary moments," she told me after reviewing my first portfolio. "These photographs tell stories." Stories. I was learning to tell new ones, about strength rather than sacrifice, about discovering rather than losing, about beginning rather than ending. Spring came early to Brooklyn that year. By March, the daffodils were blooming in Prospect Park, and I was walking there regularly with my camera, documenting the city's reawakening after winter. One morning, while photographing an elderly couple sharing a bench and a coffee, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing?" The question sounded different than usual, less perfunctory. I decided to answer honestly. "I'm doing well, actually. I'm taking a photography class, spending more time in the neighborhood. It's been a good winter for me." "That's great. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about David." My stomach tightened. "What about him? He called me last week. He says you've cut him off financially and he's pretty upset about it. He thinks you're being unreasonable." I lowered my camera and found a bench where I could sit down for this conversation. "Michael, has David told you about Christmas morning? He mentioned you had some kind of fight." So David's version had edited out the part where I'd found him tied to a chair as part of an elaborate scheme to manipulate me. This didn't surprise me, but it clarified how the family narrative was being shaped. I told Michael the truth about Christmas morning, about the months of staged financial crises, about my decision to stop enabling behavior that was hurting both David and me. Jesus, Mom, I had no idea it was that bad. "What did you think was happening?" A long pause. "I guess I thought you liked helping. You never complained. You always found the money somehow. Because complaining would have meant risking the little contact I had with my children." Another pause. "I never thought about it like that. Michael, can I ask you something?" "Sure. When you asked me to invest in that property deal last year, were you planning to pay me back?" The longest pause yet. Then, quietly, "I hoped I would be able to." "But you didn't have any kind of solid plan for it." "No, I thought if I made money on the deal, I'd pay you back with interest. If I didn't make money, well, you're my mom. You wouldn't really hold it against me." There it was. The assumption that my love made me a safe person to disappoint, that maternal bonds justified financial risks they would never have asked a friend or business partner to absorb. "Michael, I worked 3 jobs to put money aside for retirement, and I gave most of it away trying to help my boys succeed. I'm 70 years old, living on Social Security, and what little I can still earn cleaning houses. When you don't pay me back, I go without groceries. I wear clothes with holes in them. I skip doctor appointments because I can't afford the copays. Mom, I didn't realize—" "You didn't ask. Neither of you ever asked what your emergencies were costing me. You assumed I had endless resources, or that my financial struggles didn't matter as much as yours." I could hear Michael crying on the other end of the line, 3,000 miles away in California. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I've been a terrible son." "You've been a son who didn't think about the consequences of his choices. There's a difference, and it's not too late to change." We talked for another hour, the longest genuine conversation we'd had in years. Michael told me about his work, his struggles, his dreams. I told him about my photography class, about Mrs. Rivera, about the small but meaningful life I was building for myself. "I want to pay you back," he said before we hung up. "I want you to be okay more than I want my money back. But if you can afford to repay some of it, I'd be grateful." "And Michael?" "Yeah?" "I'd like for us to talk regularly, just to talk. Not because you need something or I need something, but because we're family, and family should know each other." "I'd like that too." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, I felt like I might actually have a relationship with my son rather than just a financial arrangement. David, however, was another story entirely. In April, I received a letter from him, not a phone call, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to my apartment. The envelope was addressed in his familiar scrawl, the handwriting I'd helped him practice when he was 7 years old. Inside was a 3-page plea that managed to be simultaneously manipulative and heartbreaking. He apologized for Christmas morning, but in a way that minimized what had actually happened. He was, "Sorry I misunderstood the situation," and "Sorry you felt hurt." Not sorry for staging an elaborate deception, but sorry I'd reacted badly to his creativity in solving financial problems. The letter went on to explain his current difficulties in great detail. Jennifer was threatening to leave him if he didn't get his gambling under control. He owed money to dangerous people. He was trying to get into a treatment program, but he needed funds to cover the cost. "Mom, I know I've made mistakes, but I'm your son. I need help, and you're the only person I can turn to. If you could just loan me $2,000 to get into this program, I promise things will be different." $2,000. More money than I'd ever given him at once, for a treatment program he'd never mentioned before, to solve problems that seemed to multiply rather than resolve no matter how much money I'd provided over the years. I read the letter 3 times. Sitting at my kitchen table with the morning light streaming through windows, I'd actually had the money to wash professionally for the first time in years. Then I did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I wrote him back. "Dear David," I wrote, "I received your letter, and I appreciate you taking the time to explain your situation. I understand that you're struggling, and I'm sorry you're going through such a difficult time. However, I will not be providing financial assistance for your treatment program or any other expenses. This decision isn't made out of anger or punishment, but out of recognition that my financial help has not actually helped you develop the skills and resources you need to manage your own life. If you genuinely want to get treatment for gambling addiction, there are community resources available that don't require upfront payment. If you need help finding them, I'm happy to research options with you. What I will not do is continue to enable behavior that hurts both of us. I love you, but I love you enough to stop participating in your self-destruction. If you would like to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than financial transactions, I'm interested in having that conversation. If not, I understand. But my decision about money will not change. Love, Mom." I mailed the letter before I could second-guess myself, then called Dr. Walsh to process the anxiety and grief that came with setting such a firm boundary with my child. "How does it feel to have written that?" she asked. "Terrifying," I admitted, "and necessary, and sad, all at the same time. That's normal. Healthy boundaries often feel uncomfortable at first, especially when you've never maintained them before." May brought warm weather and a phone call that changed everything. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the NYPD. We have your son David in custody, and he listed you as his emergency contact." My hands started shaking before she'd finished the sentence. "Is he hurt? What happened?" "He's unharmed, but he's been arrested for fraud. Specifically, for running a scam where he would stage home invasions and then ask elderly relatives for money to pay off fake debts." The room spun. I sat down hard on my kitchen chair, trying to process what the detective was telling me. How many people did he victimize? "We're still investigating, but it appears he ran similar operations on at least 6 different family members over the past 2 years. Your Christmas morning experience was actually key evidence that helped us understand his pattern." Christmas morning. The scene I'd walked away from, the manipulation I'd refused to enable, had apparently been part of a much larger pattern of elder abuse that affected multiple family members. "Can you tell me who else he was targeting?" Detective Martinez couldn't give me specific names due to privacy laws, but she could tell me that David had apparently been running various versions of his tied to a chair scheme on elderly relatives across the northeastern United States. His gambling debts were real, but his solutions had involved systematically defrauding family members who loved him too much to question his increasingly elaborate stories. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to commend you for walking away from that situation on Christmas. Your refusal to provide money when you discovered his deception likely prevented him from victimizing you and others for months longer. I didn't feel like someone who deserved commendation. I felt like a mother whose son was sitting in jail because I'd failed to teach him the difference between love and exploitation. But Dr. Walsh helped me understand that David's choices were his own, that my previous enabling had been motivated by love even if it had ultimately been harmful, and that my recent boundary setting had actually been the most loving thing I could have done. You gave him the opportunity to change course, she reminded me. He chose to escalate instead. That's not your fault. The trial was scheduled for September. David's court-appointed attorney contacted me about providing character testimony. But after discussing it with Dr. Walsh and Sarah Chen, I decided that honesty would serve everyone better than misguided loyalty. I testified about our family history, about the pattern of financial requests that had escalated over the years, about the Christmas morning scene that had finally opened my eyes to what was actually happening. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also one of the most honest. David was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims. The judge recommended that he participate in gambling addiction treatment while incarcerated and suggested family counseling before any attempts at reconciliation. But by then, something had shifted in me so fundamentally that the idea of reconciliation felt less urgent than it once might have. Summer brought opportunities I'd never imagined. My photography had improved enough that Ashley encouraged me to submit some pictures to a community art show. 3 of my photographs were accepted, images of Brooklyn life that captured both the city's grit and its unexpected beauty. On the opening night of the show, Mrs. Rivera came as my guest, wearing her best dress and beaming with pride as she introduced me to other attendees. "This is my friend Margaret," she'd say. "She's a wonderful photographer. Not someone's mother, not someone's burden. A photographer, a person with her own identity and accomplishments." Michael called regularly now, true to his promise. Our conversations had evolved from crisis-driven transactions to actual relationship building. He told me about his work as a software engineer, about the hiking trips he took in the California mountains, about the woman he'd been seeing for 6 months. "I'd like you to meet her sometime," he said during one of our July calls. "I'd like that too. Maybe you could come out here for Thanksgiving. I could pay for the plane ticket." The offer to pay for my travel felt different than his old requests for money. It was driven by generosity rather than desperation, by a desire to include me rather than exploit me. "Let me think about it," I said. But I was already imagining what it would feel like to spend a holiday where I was wanted rather than tolerated. August brought another unexpected development. Tyler, now 10 years old and living with Jennifer's parents while David served his sentence, called me one afternoon. "Grandma Margaret, it's Tyler. Mom gave me your number." My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken to any of David's family since the Christmas morning incident. Had assumed that my refusal to continue funding David's lifestyle had made me persona non grata with Jennifer and the children. "Tyler, honey, how are you?" "I'm okay. I wanted to ask you something. Mom told me that Dad did some bad things, and you tried to help him, but he wasn't ready to be helped. Is that true?" God bless Jennifer for finding an age-appropriate way to explain a complicated situation without demonizing either parent. "That's true," I said carefully. "I'm sorry he hurt you. Mom showed me some of the Christmas presents you brought last year. I never said thank you." 10 years old, and he was apologizing for his father's behavior while displaying more maturity than David had shown in decades. "You don't need to apologize for your father, sweetheart, and you're welcome for the presents. I enjoyed picking them out for you. Could I maybe visit you sometime? Mom says she could bring me on the subway if you want to have visitors." I started crying right there in my kitchen, tears of joy for the first time in longer than I could remember. I would love that more than anything. Tyler and Jennifer visited 2 weeks later. Jennifer was quieter than I remembered, worn down by months of dealing with the fallout from David's legal troubles and financial deceptions. but she was also warmer, more genuine, as if crisis had burned away the superficial politeness that had always kept us at arm's length. "Mrs. Thompson, I owe you an apology," she said, while Tyler explored my apartment with the curiosity of a child discovering a new world. "I didn't know how bad things had gotten with David's gambling, or how much money he was taking from you. I should have paid more attention. You were managing your own family and dealing with your own challenges," I told her. "I don't blame you for David's choices. Still, I'm sorry. And I want Tyler and Lucas to know their grandmother, if you're interested." Lucas, now almost a year old, was walking and babbling and had his father's dark eyes, but none of his father's calculating expression. He reached for me with the uncomplicated trust of a baby who hadn't yet learned that adults sometimes disappointed you. Holding my youngest grandson in my arms, watching Tyler examine my photography equipment with careful hands and genuine interest, I realized something profound. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or guilt or financial transaction, but simple, mutual affection. September brought David's sentencing, but it also brought a letter from Michael with a plane ticket to San Francisco enclosed. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said about family knowing each other. I realized I don't really know who you are outside of being my mother. I'd like to change that. Please come for Thanksgiving. I want you to meet Sarah. And I want to show you my life here. No strings attached, no agenda, just time together." The flight to California was my first time on an airplane in over 15 years. As we lifted off from JFK, I looked down at the Brooklyn neighborhoods spread out below and felt something I'd never experienced before. Excitement about the future rather than anxiety about the past. Michael met me at the airport with flowers and a genuine smile. He looked older than I'd expected, 43 with gray threading through his dark hair, but healthier than I'd seen him in years. Success suited him in a way that struggle never had. "Mom, you look great," he said, and I realized it was probably true. Months of walking regularly, eating better food because I could afford it, sleeping peacefully because I wasn't constantly worried about family crises, all of it had improved my health in visible ways. His apartment in Oakland had a view of the Bay Bridge and walls covered with photographs he'd taken during his hiking adventures. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of natural warmth that made conversation easy. "Michael's told me so much about your photography," she said over dinner that first night. "I'd love to see some of your work." We spent the evening looking through printouts I'd brought from my Brooklyn series, talking about light and composition and the stories that ordinary moments could tell. For the first time in decades, I was sharing something I'd created rather than something I'd sacrificed. "You have a real gift," Sarah said, studying a photograph I'd taken of an elderly man feeding pigeons in Prospect Park. "There's so much empathy in your work." Empathy. Maybe that's what I'd been developing all these years. Not just the ability to absorb other people's pain, but the capacity to witness it with wisdom and compassion rather than enabling and codependency. Thanksgiving dinner was small but perfect. Michael cooked, something I'd never known he could do, while Sarah and I set the table and shared stories about our childhoods. The conversation flowed naturally, covering everything from politics to books to travel dreams. "Mom, I have something for you," Michael said as we were finishing dessert. He handed me an envelope with my name written on it in his careful handwriting. Inside was a check for $7,000 and a letter. "Dear Mom," the letter read, "I've been calculating what I owe you for years of loans I never repaid. This doesn't cover everything, but it's a start. More importantly, I want you to know that I understand now what those loans cost you, not just financially, but emotionally. I took advantage of your love, and I'm sorry. I hope we can continue building a relationship based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided support. I love you, and I'm proud to be your son, Michael." I cried reading it, but they were healing tears rather than grief tears. The flight back to Brooklyn felt different than the flight out. I wasn't running from something anymore. I was returning to a life I'd chosen and built for myself. Mrs. Rivera met me at my apartment door with a cup of tea and excited questions about my trip. We sat in my living room, now decorated with some of my framed photographs, while I told her about Michael and Sarah, about Thanksgiving dinner and San Francisco's foggy mornings, and the feeling of being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. "You see?" she said, patting my hand with her weathered fingers. "You chose yourself, and the world chose you back." December arrived with unusual warmth. Climate change had made Brooklyn's winters milder, but this year felt especially gentle, as if the universe was offering me a softer landing after such a difficult transformation. Christmas approached without the anxiety that had marked previous years. I had plans: dinner with Mrs. Rivera and 2 other neighbors who'd become friends, a morning walk in Prospect Park to photograph the winter light, an evening phone call with Michael and Sarah. But I also had something I'd never had before: genuine peace with the idea of being alone. Solitude no longer felt like punishment or failure. It felt like space to breathe, room to grow, freedom to choose. 2 days before Christmas, Jennifer called. "Mrs. Thompson, I know this might be presumptuous, but Tyler's been asking about you constantly. Would you like to spend Christmas morning with us? Just you, me, and the boys. No drama, no expectations. Tyler wants to show you a photo essay he's been working on for school." A photo essay. My 10-year-old grandson had inherited some version of the artistic eye that had taken me 70 years to recognize in myself. Christmas morning in Jennifer's temporary apartment was nothing like the elaborate productions I'd endured in previous years. It was small and simple and real. Tyler proudly showed me his photo essay about immigration in his Queens neighborhood, pictures he'd taken with a disposable camera his teacher had provided, captions he'd written about the stories behind the faces. "You inspired me, Grandma," he said, leaning against my arm while we looked through his photographs together. "Mom told me you're a real photographer now." Lucas toddled around the living room, occasionally stopping to pat my knee or offer me whatever toy he was currently carrying. At 14 months, he was beginning to say recognizable words: book and up, and miraculously, gamma, when he saw me. Jennifer had made cinnamon rolls from scratch, and we ate them while Tyler read us the Christmas story from a children's book, complete with theatrical voices for all the characters. It was the first Christmas morning in decades that felt like celebration rather than endurance. "Thank you for giving us another chance," Jennifer said as I was getting ready to leave. "Thank you for giving me one," I replied. Walking back to the subway, my camera bag over one shoulder and Tyler's handmade Christmas card in my purse, I realized something profound. This was what resurrection felt like. Not dramatic or sudden, but gradual and earned, built through hundreds of small choices to value myself as much as I valued others. The train back to Brooklyn was nearly empty. Just a few other people heading home from their own Christmas celebrations. I found a seat by the window and watched familiar neighborhoods flash by, thinking about the year that was ending and the life that was just beginning. At 70, I'd learned something that might have saved me decades of heartache if I'd understood it sooner. Love without boundaries isn't actually love. It's a transaction disguised as affection, enabling disguised as nurturing, fear disguised as generosity. Real love, the kind that actually helps people grow and thrive, requires the courage to say no when yes would do harm. It requires the wisdom to distinguish between supporting someone and carrying them. It requires the strength to let people experience consequences, rather than constantly rescuing them from their own choices. My phone rang as the train pulled into my station. Michael's name appeared on the screen. "Merry Christmas, Mom. How was your morning?" "Perfect," I said, and meant it. We talked during my walk from the subway to my apartment, sharing details about our respective Christmas celebrations. Sarah had loved the photography book I'd sent her. They were planning a spring trip to Europe, and wanted recommendations for the most photogenic neighborhoods in Paris. I've never been to Paris, I admitted. Well, maybe that should change. Sarah and I were thinking, what if you came with us? If you're interested, I mean. We could help with the costs. Paris, at 70, with my son and his girlfriend who genuinely enjoyed my company and wanted to share experiences with me rather than extract resources from me. I'm very interested, I said. Back in my apartment, I made tea and settled into my favorite chair with the new photography magazine Mrs. Rivera had given me for Christmas. The winter sun streamed through my clean windows, illuminating the small but meaningful life I'd built for myself. On the side table was a letter that had arrived yesterday, forwarded from David's prison address. I'd been debating whether to open it, but Christmas morning felt like the right time for whatever he had to say. Dear Mom, the letter began, in handwriting that looked more careful than usual, as if he'd taken time with each word. I've been in a treatment program here, and part of it involves making amends to people I've hurt. I know I've hurt you more than I can probably even understand, and I'm sorry. Not sorry that I got caught, but actually sorry for the choices I made and the way I treated you. I'm learning about addiction, not just to gambling, but to using other people to solve my problems. I realize now that I trained myself to see you as a solution instead of a person, and that was wrong. It was cruel, even if I didn't think about it that way at the time. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did, and I'm trying to figure out how to be different. If someday, after I get out and prove that I've actually changed, you're willing to try having a relationship that doesn't involve me needing things from you, I'd like that. But if you're not, I understand that too. Thank you for walking away from me on Christmas morning last year. I was angry about it then, but I understand now that it was the first time anyone loved me enough to refuse to enable me. It probably saved my life, even though it took me a year to see it. I hope you're well and happy. You deserve to be. Love, David. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of manipulation or guilt or obligation, but tears of genuine hope that my son might finally be learning the difference between love and exploitation. I didn't plan to respond immediately. Words were cheap, and David had always been good with words. But if he was serious about change, if he was genuinely committed to building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided support, there might be room for careful, boundaried reconciliation in our future. If not, I'd learned that I could build a meaningful life without his presence in it. As evening approached, I prepared for my dinner with Mrs. Rivera and our neighbors Elena and Rosa, 2 sisters in their 80s who'd moved to Brooklyn from Puerto Rico in the 1960s. These women had become my chosen family, the people who knew my stories and celebrated my victories and offered comfort during my struggles without expecting anything in return. We'd planned a potluck dinner followed by a walk through the neighborhood to look at Christmas lights. Simple pleasures, but rich with the kind of connection I'd spent decades seeking in all the wrong places. Getting dressed for dinner, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone I hadn't seen in years. A woman who liked herself, who had interests and friendships, and plans for the future that weren't contingent on other people's approval or financial need. My hair was completely gray now, but I'd stopped coloring it months ago and discovered it was actually quite lovely, silver and white with subtle waves that framed my face in a way that looked distinguished rather than old. I'd lost some weight since learning to cook for myself without the constant stress of family financial crises. Not dramatic weight loss, but enough that clothes fit better and I moved with more energy and confidence. Most importantly, my eyes looked different. The anxiety and defeat that had lived there for so long had been replaced by something I'd forgotten I was capable of: curiosity about what came next. As I walked to Mrs. Rivera's apartment, my camera tucked into my purse in case we encountered any interesting light during our evening walk. I thought about you, listening to my story right now. Maybe you recognize something in my journey. Maybe you found yourself funding other people's poor choices while neglecting your own needs. Maybe you've confused love with enabling, generosity with martyrdom, family loyalty with financial exploitation. If so, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose differently. It's never too late to set boundaries, to say no to requests that diminish you, to insist on relationships that flow in both directions rather than just drain you dry. It's never too late to discover who you are when you're not constantly solving other people's problems, or absorbing other people's emotions, or financing other people's dreams at the expense of your own. The hardest part isn't learning to say no to people who take advantage of your love. The hardest part is learning to say yes to yourself, yes to your own dreams, your own needs, your own right to be valued for who you are rather than what you can provide. I spent 7 decades of my life believing that my worth was measured by my willingness to sacrifice for others. I spent 7 decades thinking that being needed was the same thing as being loved, that being used was better than being alone. I was wrong about all of it. Real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself. Real family doesn't treat you like an ATM with emotions. Real relationships are built on mutual respect, shared joy, reciprocal care, rather than one-sided support. At 70, I finally learned to love myself enough to demand that others love me properly or not at all. The result wasn't the isolation I'd always feared. It was the genuine connection I'd always craved. My son Michael learned that he could have a relationship with his mother based on affection rather than transaction. My grandson Tyler discovered that his grandmother was a person with interests and talents worth knowing. My neighbor Mrs. Rivera found a friend who could give and receive support in equal measure. Even David, from his prison cell, is apparently learning that manipulation isn't love and that the people who refuse to enable you might be the ones who care about you most. Tonight, I'll have dinner with women who choose to spend time with me because they enjoy my company, not because they need something from me. Tomorrow, I'll wake up in my small but comfortable apartment and decide how to spend my day based on my own interests and energy levels, not someone else's crisis or demands. Next month, I'll celebrate my 71st birthday by planning a solo photography trip to New England, something I never would have imagined doing when I was convinced that my only value lay in serving others. This spring, if all goes well, I'll travel to Paris with Michael and Sarah, seeing the city of light through the lens of a camera I bought with money I didn't have to send to someone else's emergency. This is what choosing yourself looks like. Not selfish indulgence, but healthy self-respect. Not abandoning the people you love, but refusing to be abandoned by them while pretending it's actually love. Have you ever lived something similar to my story? Do you recognize the patterns of financial manipulation disguised as family obligation? Have you found yourself giving until you had nothing left, only to be blamed for not giving more? Please share your experience in the comments below. Sometimes the first step toward change is simply acknowledging that what you've accepted as normal is actually dysfunction disguised as love. If my story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sharing these difficult truths helps them reach other people who might need to hear that they deserve better than financial exploitation, wearing the mask of family loyalty. Remember, you are valuable for who you are, not just for what you can provide. Your love is a gift, not a debt you owe for the privilege of existing in other people's lives. And it's never, ever too late to choose yourself. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for witnessing my journey from victim to victor, from enabler to self-advocate, from someone who confused love with money to someone who finally learned the difference. The sun is setting over Brooklyn now, painting my apartment walls with golden light that feels like possibility made visible. Tomorrow will bring new choices, new opportunities to practice the self-respect I've learned, new chances to build relationships based on mutual care, rather than one-sided sacrifice. I can hardly wait to see what comes next.